So we talked about those three main areas of the heart. Right, figure 18.3, you can see the walls of the heart there, heart wall, the epicardium, the myocardium, and the endocardium. And we need to make sure that we understand where those are at, right? And then also look at the pericardial layer as well, and know that there's a pericardial cavity and that there's fluid also bathing in between that double membrane system. And then we look at those, right? The two top chambers and the two bottom chambers, the two atria and the two ventricles. And as I mentioned, that they're actually two separate pumps in one pump, the left side and the right side. So one atria and one ventricle pump blood through the heart. One atria, one ventricle pump blood through the heart as well, except the direction that they're going. And I told you guys yesterday, hopefully you guys did some homework and looked at the pathway of blood or travel of blood through the heart to systemic circulation and pathway of blood through the heart to pulmonary circulation, and that you got to see some of these terms and understand where they come from in the right versus the left. We'll go through it again here as well. But we're looking at this figure here in your book. This is part, 18.5A or E, sorry, showing you the cutaway of the heart, looking at the chambers, if you will, and then all the anatomical features of it also. Now, I mentioned to all of you yesterday is that there's actually some vessels that feed the heart blood and also take heart blood away from the heart as far as deoxygenated or oxygenated blood. Here are the sulcus, and I think somebody mentioned yesterday in lab, what are the sulci? Those are the grooves that we use. We call those the same name that we call them in the brain. These grooves where you actually will find the blood vessels in between in this groove here, right? And located in the groove will be this this fat adipose tissue that is normally part of the heart as well, right? So there's three different types of sulcus, right? Make sure you know the three different types of sulcus. Where do you find those, right? The one that's the most, I would say the most important, all three of them are important, but the one that's most important is the coronary sulcus, because that is actually where you have the coronary artery and vein. Okay, so that's the major artery and the major vein that feeds, and then everything that branches from there becomes the rest of the arteries and veins that you see on the surface of the heart. And you can see this here. This is figure 18.5B, right? And B shows you then the coronary sulcus, the interventricular sulcus, right? And then shows you, in fact, that fat tissue. That yellow stuff represents the fat tissue, and then it also represents the arteries and veins that are setting basically in the groove on top of the heart. At the end of those arteries and veins will branch out into smaller arteries and veins, and then will become the capillary bed that feeds the outside layer and the inside layers, the three actually layers of the heart wall, feed nutrients and oxygen and take out waste and carbon dioxide. Okay. This figure, that big huge blue vein there, vessel, is the coronary sinus, right? Coronary sinus is actually dropping its blood into the right atrium. Okay? That's where that's going to. You just don't see it there because it's on the outside of the heart. You don't see where it's interjecting, but it's by the vena. Okay? Now the left atrium is going to receive oxygenated blood from the lungs, as I mentioned. There are actually 4 pulmonary veins that return blood from the lungs, pulmonary veins. And here's what I want to mention to kind of clear that up, because many students will get confused on what is an artery versus what is a vein. Okay, so the key word is not the definition. So the definition is incorrect if you say artery means oxygenated blood, veins mean deoxygenated blood. What that actually means is blood coming from or to the heart. Okay? Coming from or to the heart. Okay, that's the definition between artery and vein. So when blood comes to the heart, okay, any blood in the blood system, in the cardiovascular system, that blood goes to the heart. To the heart. It's called a vein. Okay? Make sure you write that down definition-wise because that's the definition. Blood returns or comes to the heart, that is a vein. The blood that goes away from the heart is called an artery. Okay? So when you're looking at arteries and veins, which we will in the next chapter, then an artery and vein by definition is the blood flowing to the heart or away from the heart. Going back to pulmonary veins, right, are bringing blood from the lungs to the heart. Now the confusing part for many folks trying to study this at the beginning is that this blood is actually oxygenated. These veins, these four veins, are oxygenated blood. Because it's going to the left atrium, because that blood's oxygenated. What it has done is that blood has actually gone to the lungs, dropped off carbon dioxide, picked up oxygen, and brought that oxygenated blood to the left side of the heart. That's where they're coming from. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so the direction of blood, is it going towards the heart or away from the heart? That's vein, artery, respectively. Okay? So again, we're just looking at the heart again. The reason why there's this picture several times in several different ways, because we've got to look at it several different ways. So as we study atria, coronary sinus, then we go back to the figure and okay, this is where the coronary sinus is. This is where the pulmonary veins are at. And you go reference back to the figure consistently in the heart, and that helps you to understand the complete picture. It also helps you to understand the anatomical terms, right? So here are the ventricles, the discharging chambers. We call them discharging because they're not receiving blood per se from parts of the body. They're pushing blood, right, out to different parts of the body. Okay? So if you're the left ventricle, or let's start with the right ventricle. If you're the right ventricle, okay, then you're pushing blood. If you're the right ventricle, you're pushing blood out of the heart to the lungs, because that's deoxygenated blood. That's oxygen poor blood. You're pumping blood out to the lungs. If you're the left ventricle, you're pumping blood to all of the body, or the systemic circulation. Okay? Again, blood flow is important because then we can put on the vessels and then we can see those vessels there as well. We know just looking at the comparing the chambers here that the ventricles are much thicker than the atria. And the ventricles actually do the pumping of blood to the lungs and to the body. That's where the pumping really occurs. When the heart beats, most of that muscle is at the bottom of the heart. Most of that muscle is pushing on ventricles. That's where most of the pump out of the heart is occurring, at the ventricles. The atria are important. They're receiving chambers. They're going to send that blood to the ventricles, and then the ventricles will pump it out. Okay, so the atria are important, but the ventricles do the pumping. That's where the actual pumping will occur. So the right ventricle, since it's oxygen poor, and you could write that if you had the power point out, or if you said right ventricle, you can, in parentheses, you can put oxygen, poor blood. Because that helps you, again, to understand where it's going to. It's going to pump that blood through the ventricle to another outside portion of the heart, and we call that the pulmonary trunk. The pulmonary trunk is not considered the heart itself proper, technically considered. It's now considered part of a blood vessel. The pulmonary trunk is a blood vessel, but it's attached to the heart, obviously. And why do we call it a trunk? Because it actually looks like a trunk of a tree, where there's going to be the tree trunk, and then the tree trunk will then branch into two places. And it forms an actual T. It T's out, or Y's, actually Y's out. Looks like a Y or a T. Now, why is it doing that? What's the purpose of that? Because as it branches, it's going to branch to the left side of the lung and the right side of the lung. Does that make sense? Right? It's going to branch out. The left ventricle, okay, will pump blood to the aorta, and now that is another vessel, blood vessel, and that's oxygen-rich blood. That vessel is actually an artery. That's the largest artery we have. That's the aorta, right? And this one actually arches. It's more of an arch. It goes kind of up and down, right? And so when you look at that, again, that's why we have this figure, right? Again, same figure in different ways. Sorry. Same figure in different ways. Because then I can say, I can study right ventricle, right atria, pulmonary trunk, aorta, and I say, okay, let me look at the figure so I know where that's at, right? And you look at this T-shaped kind of structure, the blue where it kind of goes right and left, or left and right, whatever you're looking at. So that's the the right ventricle pushing blood out, going to the left side and the right side. You can see where it's, labeled for you: left pulmonary artery, right pulmonary artery, left and right. And again, artery, the definition of artery is blood flowing out of the heart, right? So by definition, that's an artery. Again, that's confusing because probably coming into this class, you thought artery is always oxygen-rich blood. And that's not the proper definition. And then you can also see the left ventricle pushing blood through itself in the backside of the pulmonary trunk. And that's what's confusing, because the pulmonary trunk sits on top or in front of the aorta. The aorta is behind. You see the aorta kind of arches, and then it forms these little three kind of vessels that go up. Those are the other vessels that pump blood to the neck and the face and the brain, right? And then also to the arms, by the way. Because one goes up to the neck and the head and the brain. The other two go to the upper limbs, right? Left upper limb, right upper limb. That's where they go. And if you're studying vessels, this is the brachiocephalic, and that becomes the brachial artery and all of that other stuff. Okay, so let's talk about the valves, because now we're discussing valves here, right? Valves. So what are valves? What are their function? We'll look at the structure, but also what their function is. That's the really important part, right? They give you a one-way, unidirectional, one-way flow of blood through the heart. So that means the valve catches to prevent blood from backflowing. Okay? Backflowing. This is a one-way system, right? And the valves, when they're closed, prevent blood from flowing back into one of the chambers, the aorta or the atria, the vessels, or the ventricles. Okay? So we classify the valves that we have in the heart in two major ways, right? If you're an atrial ventricle valve, for short, we call those AV. Letter A, letter V, valve. So you can put that in parentheses, AV valve. And the other type we call semilunar valves, or SL valves. It's otherwise put in that context. The AV valves are located between the atria and the ventricles. Or you can put in parentheses between the chambers. Right? If that helps you to understand it better. Because that's really what that means, right? Between the atria and the ventricles, it means between the chambers. So that means a right atria and the right ventricle have a AV valve in between it. Does that make sense? And the left atria and the left ventricle have an AV valve in between. Now those two are going to have different names. We'll see, we'll look at them in just a second, right? But they'll have different names. They're types of valves, types of AV valves. The SL valves separate the ventricles from the major arteries. Okay? What do I mean by that? Right ventricle this SL valve separates the right ventricle from the pulmonary trunk, right? And the left ventricle separates that ventricle from the aorta. So there's a valve there. Okay? Again, that's why anatomy is important. That's why we're studying all these terms and names and everything, because then when we look at blood flow and how this is working, the valves, and well, it helps to understand the definition, right? Or the name. Okay? So no valves are between the major veins and arteries. Okay? And the atria. And the reason why, because you won't see, for example, valves in between the inferior and superior vena cava. There's no valve in between those and the atria, right? Because inertia is occurring. There's a pressure system, and because the flow is only going one way, and the heart is always pumping, that means there's always pressure involved, it doesn't have time to go backwards. Does that make sense? The river is always flowing one way. Does that make sense? It's always flowing one way. Because of that, then we don't need to have valves holding the veins in the atrium apart. So here are the valves, and this is a difficult figure to look at, but we're also looking from the top down. But we really want to look at how the valves look like when they're closed, okay, and how they're separating them. First of all, you got to look at what's anterior versus posterior, so make sure that you see that the left side, part A, shows you the anterior side, where the anterior side is in the front, and then the posterior side is in the back, right? And then we're looking at those valves, right? The first two in the front, the aortic and the pulmonary valve, are those semilunar valves. Semilunar valves. They're separating the ventricles and the major arteries, pulmonary trunk and the aorta. That's why it's called the aortic valve, because that one's separating the aorta and the left atrium, and the pulmonary valve is separating the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. And the ones that are in the top, if you would look at the figure and it looks like the ones on the top, the bigger ones, if you will, are what we call AV valves, or those are also known as mitral and tricuspid valve. And that's what you see there, right? Much bigger, right? And those are separating the atria and the ventricles. So between the atria and the ventricles, we have two valves there, the tricuspid and the mitral. Tricuspid is named for how many flaps there are in the valve. There's 3, obviously. Let's call it tricuspid. And again, that's right atria, right ventricle. The mitral, otherwise known as AKA bicuspid, so it's in the parentheses there, but that's the bicuspid. Easier way to memorize it, tricuspid, bicuspid. There's only two flaps. We call them cusps because they're not flaps, they're actually cupped. They kind of have a little cup there. Okay. So again, that's the atrial. The mitral valve, or bicuspid valve, because there's 2. Okay. No, just the main one. Okay. So what attaches to the actual cusp or flap is a connective tissue we call chordae tendineae. Chordae tendineae, which are cords, right? Tendon cords is what that means in Latin. This is Latin text, by the way. Chordae tendineae is, okay, tendon cords, basically. So they're attached to the AV valves, both the tricuspid and bicuspid valves. And that cord, tendon cord, is actually attached to the flap and to what we call papillary muscle. Now, the papillary muscle is actually an aggregate, a growth inside of the ventricle that attaches to the tendon cord, which is connective tissue. That when we contract and relax it, it pulls on the tendon and then pulls the flap open or keeps the flap closed. Okay? And that's what you see there. Really pretty picture in part A. That's actually a really live picture. That's a picture if we took a look at, we put a camera into the heart and then looked at those chordae tendineae and the papillary muscle, right? And on the very top of the photo, right, is the flap in the closed position, in fact. It's in the closed position, okay? Chordae tendineae attached to one papillary muscle. There's actually a couple there, but you can see that, really interesting stuff. And on the right side, part D, you can see the cadaver, right? It's the heart, human heart, a cadaver, sectioned open. You can see the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscle. And hopefully you got to see that in the dissection, right? Got to identify those. So here is just showing you how the valves work, right? In the fact that because of inertia, because of the direction of blood flow, how the flow is flowing, the weight of the blood and the force of the blood pushes the cup or the flaps open. And that's what you're seeing on the right side, the small box there. The red arrow represents blood flowing in, pushing open the valve or the flaps. Does that make sense, right? See that there? So obviously the papillary muscle needs to be in the relaxed state, on the relaxed muscle state, to allow the flaps to just flap open. Blood fills up, and when blood starts to fill up in the ventricles, okay, this. You see how the cups are upside down? You see how they're kind of like this, right? And so they pop open, and then when the blood fills up, they push against the cup, and the cup goes up. And the papillary muscles also contract to keep the kind of chordae tendineae and pushing up on the cup to keep it closed. Now, obviously, you can see on the right side of the atrium is not filled up with blood, but in fact, in reality, there's blood there too. It's starting to fill up. There's never an empty space in the whole blood system where there's going to be gas or air. Does that make sense? There's no air in the lines anywhere. It's always filled up with blood somewhere. Does that make sense to you? Even though on the figure on the left and the right shows you that there's just a white space in the atria, there's actually filled up with blood. We just don't show it. We're just trying to show you where the blood is filling in the ventricle. Okay, I want to make sure that you understand that because I've had students get confused. They think that there's air on that side, but there's no air. It's all filled up with blood, no matter what chamber we're talking about. Okay, just looking at those valves. So what about the semilunar valves, right? Again, they prevent backflow from the arteries back into the ventricles. That's the dividing line, if you will, barrier. As pressures change, because the ventricle will be relaxed at one given point, and then not be relaxed, it'll contract and push blood. As those pressures change, they will open and close in response to that. Okay? These represent a half moon kind of flap, and that's why we call it semiluna, right? It's kind of like a crescent moon kind of thing, or half moon. That's what they look like. That's why we call them semilunar, half moon, little flaps or cusps. And the one that separates the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk is called the pulmonary semilunar valve. And the one that separates the left ventricle and the aorta is called the aortic valve. Okay? Named for the vessel, basically. I want you to look at the myocardial muscle in the ventricle. See the heart wall, see how it's changed here, right? And then I want you to we're going to go forward and see how the heart wall has changed. Because the muscles here, the cardiac muscle, that's the myocardial muscle, is in the relaxed state. Right? There's no blood pressure pushing against from the muscle, causing this push of the blood out yet at this point. At this point, we're just seeing the blood flowing back to the cusp, and the cusp or the cup catches the blood and then closes the valve. Everybody see that occurring? So in these two types of situations, we see then the valves not working correctly, right? This is that abnormality. This is the pathology here that we're seeing when valves don't work right. In the first one, we call this an incompetent valve, right? Blood backflows, right? So the heart pumps the same blood over and over again. It'll pump it out, and it'll fall back in. It'll pump it out, and it'll fall back in. Pump it out, and it'll fall back in. Why? Probably because those valves are either too weak, or the chordae tendineae is too weak, or the muscle might be too weak, or the valves themselves might be too flappy, right? And because of that, they don't catch just right. The cups don't catch. They'll kind of, maybe one of them won't catch right, and it'll stay in this kind of open position. One of the cups will kind of be slightly open, or they'll be so kind of loose, so flappy that it'll kind of just open like that. So it'll go, the blood will flow out, and then it'll kind of just open, continue to stay open like this. Okay? What we call a valvular stenosis is the opposite. So instead of them being too weak, they're too stiff. They're too stiff. So they won't open really nice and pretty. They'll kind of be really stiff, right? So maybe they'll restrict the blood flow. Maybe they won't open all the way like this. Maybe they'll stay kind of, because they're so stiff. That's also going to be issues because blood can't go through the valve properly. And in response, the heart's going to say, you know what, I need to beat harder because I need to really push the blood out because these valves aren't letting me push it through. So it causes the heart to pump with more force, pushing blood through even more. And over time, we're going to see conditions happening as a result. Blood flow won't go to, nutrients and oxygen won't get to the tissues. Because of that, the person will, over time, be weak, lethargic. Muscle tone will probably be affected. Neuronal functioning might be affected, right? Or if the heart is having to pump, do extra work over time, what is that going to do to the muscle? The muscle will be fatigued, and the muscle will eventually stop working. You see what I'm saying? And then the heart will be weakened. Well, when you weaken the heart, it's almost impossible to kind of get that back up. I mean, in many cases. So what do they usually do? They'll replace the valve. And so this is modern science. It's actually an interesting kind of thing that we can actually replace the valves. Sometimes it's a mechanical valve, like a silicone valve or some kind of substance like that that's not organic that we use as a valve replacement. Sometimes it's animal. And the animal that works really well with our immune system that doesn't get rejected too much is a pig. So we use valves from a pig heart to replace our own valves that are defective. Or sometimes a cadaver. Somebody that has died can actually donor, right? This is part of being a donor. When you die, this is one of the ways you can be a donor. You can donate your valves, and then those can be used in valve replacement surgery. Really quick. We end up at the lungs, right? And then the lungs pick up oxygen, and that's where we start on the left side. Because the lungs go, the blood goes from the lungs through the pulmonary veins, left atrium, left ventricle. You can even put the valves like they're putting here. There's your bicuspid, left ventricle, aortic semilunar valve, aortic valve, aorta, systemic circulation. And in fact, if you're really studying blood vessels now, you can even study, okay, I want to send my blood to the neck. Where am I going to go with those vessels? Where are those vessels going through after the aorta? Well, that's the aortic arch, the carotid artery. The carotid branches to all of those other ones. Left carotid, right carotid. Then you can go to the brain and study all that, right? Or you go to the limbs, upper limbs, or you're going to do the aorta all the way down the abdominal to the lower limbs, and you can do all of those other vessels. Okay, equal volume of blood in the pulmonary and circulation, right? Systemic circulation. Equal, right? Equal volumes. Of course, the pulmonary, because of the location, is very short and it's a low pressure circulation. That would make sense to you, you know, if you use your logic, common sense, that would tell you that since the heart is right next to the lungs, we don't need a lot of pressure to send that blood to the lungs because it's right there. Does that make sense? It's right there. But if I'm saying I need to send blood from the heart to, let's say, my tip of my toes, well, that's a really far distance for blood to travel. Because of that, the systemic circulation is a long, high friction or high blood pressure system. There's a big difference there, right? Big difference. Because of that, if you look at the function, like just looking at that, just thinking about how far blood needs to go, lungs versus tip of my toes, and then you look at the anatomy, that's where anatomy and physiology start to meet, and this is why we see another example of that, because in the left ventricle, the walls are much thicker than the right. On purpose, by nature, it's supposed to be this way. Because why is the left thicker than the right? Because the left has to pump the blood to what? Systemic circulation. Thereby, you can track it back and say, oh, well, we need more muscle, cardiac muscle. Because we need more cardiac muscle, we need to pump more of that muscle to pump more blood to get that blood to the tip of my toes, let's say. So we need a bigger, stronger left ventricle than we do the right. Because the right ventricle is just going to send the blood to the lungs. So it doesn't need to be as big. It can be small. Remember, this is a highly developed, engineered, state-of-the-art machine. Your body is a state-of-the-art machine. Most highly sensitive, efficient machine. So it's going to choose the best, most efficient, consumes the least amount of energy as possible. And that's why the body and the heart is created this way. Does that make sense to you? It's kind of going back to all that stuff. And if I look at this picture, if I just took a heart and just cut it, you know, this way, transversely, separate top and bottom, and I just look at the wall thickness, I can see the left ventricle much thicker. Can you see that circle with a bunch of muscle around it? That's the left ventricle. It's much thicker than the right ventricle. Much, much thicker. Because it pumps more, with more force to get more of that blood to the tips of your toes. We talked about coronary circulation, but that's the circulation that we actually feed our own tissue of our own heart, right? We feed our own heart itself. Heart pumps blood, but it also feeds itself. This is considered a circulation as well. So we have pulmonary circulation, systemic circulation, but then we also have coronary circulation. Coronary circulation is the shortest one that feeds just to the heart, right? It's only delivered when the heart is relaxed, when it's in the relaxed state. So blood's going to pump, that means ventricles pump, contraction, and then they relax. And the relaxed state is where blood feeds to the heart tissue. We feed most of the blood to the left ventricle because we have more cardiac muscle there than we have in all other parts of the heart. That's why it says left ventricle receives most of the coronary blood supply. The left and right coronary arteries, which is oxygenated or oxygen-rich blood, arises from the base of the aorta. That's where it comes from, base of the aorta. Okay? Right outside the semilunar valve, the aortic valve, right outside there, there's the vessels, you know, branch out from there. As I mentioned to you when we started, that the coronary arteries encircle the heart like a crown, right? That's where we have corona, right, come from. It's the Latin word meaning crown, right? And the coronary artery sits around the heart, the very top, the base, like a crown, right? Now, after that, the crown branches down and out, right? Now, the coronary artery can vary depending on the individual. So sometimes we have highly branched coronary arteries in some people. Some people do not have very highly branched coronary arteries. Now the arteries and the branching can touch each other or can branch in between the ends to each other. We call that anastomosis. Anastomosis. Or artery junctions. Which is neat to understand because it actually provides additional routes for blood. So sometimes arteries can meet, as they branch down, they can meet somewhere. And we call this anastomosis, right? Anastomosis. That's the junction. So again, the coronary artery branches to the left and to the right. So we've got a left coronary, right coronary. And then those left and right coronaries branch even farther, right? Anterior interventricular artery, circumflex, right marginal artery, posterior interventricular artery. And this is what we see, right? So we took away everything but we just want to look at the vessels. And you can see where they begin from, the base of the aorta, both left and right. They begin down, up there where after the semilunar valve where the aorta starts. And then they branch out, go around or create that crown, and then they branch down and in different places. And you can see some of the anastomosis. You can see where two arteries kind of meet and they kind of form this little mesh or this kind of web-like kind of structure. That's the junction. Those junctions will vary. So if you're a heart surgeon, you would look at different hearts, you would see the anastomosis would be different and the branching would be different depending on the person. The veins are somewhat found in the same area as the arteries would be, right? Those are collecting blood from the capillary bed of the heart they empty into the right atrium, okay, through the coronary sinus. What we see here. All those finally go into the coronary sinus, and that dumps itself into the right atrium. It's kind of where that hole, you see the hole just kind of there in the middle? That hole dumps the blood into the right atrium. Again, looking at everything else, again, we've been seeing this picture over and over again, but this is kind of where you see that. We're seeing the backside of the heart, the posterior view, because at the coronary sinus where it ends, that big blue area where it basically ends right there, that's where it's dumping into the right atrium. There. You ever heard the word angina before? Angina? Angina is actually a pain that people will perceive, a tightening of the chest, a little sharp pain in the chest. And it's actually because there is a deficiency in blood delivery to the myocardial muscle. Now, sometimes that can happen because of stress or anxiety. It can cause that little shunning. The blood arteries kind of get really small, and then blood doesn't get delivered as much to the myocardial muscle as possible. And as a result, the myocardial muscle sends signals, or the sensory neurons there send signals to the brain, like telling them, we're not measuring a lot of oxygen here. And that perceives in the brain as pain. So then you have chest pain, a little sharp pain, and then it goes away. That's angina. That makes sense? So it can be temporary. But if you have a chronic pain there, it's always like a little sharp shooting pain there like that. That's a condition of chronic angina. And that's because those vessels are not carrying enough blood. Now, those vessels can be blocked, cannot be worked correctly, and that can be a condition of cardiovascular disease. Not always, but sometimes. A myocardial infarction is the fancy word to say a heart attack. This is what a heart attack is. Heart attack comes from a coronary blockage, or many coronary blockages, because it can be one or more. Now, it depends on how much it's been blocked. And we use this word in healthcare called occlusion, or occluded. That's the verb of it, right? But an occlusion is the blockage. How much of the vessel is being blocked by plaque, right? So if you have almost a complete blockage, you're not getting blood flow at all to the myocardial muscle or the tissue, and that is a major heart attack. Because when you do not get oxygen and nutrients to the tissue, it very immediately becomes cell damage. And then immediately becomes, not immediately, but very soon after, it becomes cell death. Cells like cardiac muscle cells will begin to die, which is not good. Because we all know that muscle does not regrow, it doesn't undergo mitosis, right? Because when we took a look at skeletal muscle, we didn't talk about mitosis because it doesn't undergo mitosis. Which means if you damage or kill those cells, they don't divide and you don't have new growing muscle cell. It's just dead. You just don't get it back. The body then replaces the dead cells with scar tissue. So it fills it up with connective, elastic tissue. And that itself is a bad thing because it doesn't allow the heart to be really flexible anymore. Kind of stiffens up more and more. So having a heart attack is not a good thing. Even though you can actually have therapy to get you back almost to normal, you're not 100% normal. Does that make sense to you? You don't get 100% full functioning as you were before. Okay, just a little bit about cardiac muscle. I don't want to talk too much about it because we've already kind of gone through skeletal muscle. Much of this is the same, right? We know that cardiac muscle is striated, short, it branches, We know it's involuntary, right? Cardiac muscle is involuntary. You know, heard that before. It's not multinucleated. It's actually one nuclei, sometimes two, but it's not multinucleated like skeletal muscle. It's one nuclei. And it's got all its parts just like skeletal muscle does. Z-disc and A-band. You know, we're not going to go into detail anymore about that. But there's no triads, right? But they do have SR, sarcoplasmic reticulum that holds cardiac calcium. They do have desmosomes and gap junctions. They have a lot of gap junctions, in fact, and this is how the electrons or the ions can, excuse me, ions, not electrons, ions can pass through from one area to another and then cause muscle contraction throughout the whole heart. And this is just showing you how a cardiac muscle cell looks like and how it's branched. You see how it branches. You can see this they kind of split up and do this kind of thing. That's indicative of cardiac muscle. Here's your desmosomes and your gap junctions. That's a revisit from earlier in AMP1. That's contractile cells. Does that make sense? They do the contraction, right? That's what we're discussing. But the other ones that are self-excitable are the ones that we call pacemaker cells. They don't do any contraction. What they are involved in is to send out the signal to contract for the other muscles to contract. They initiate depolarization. Okay? They don't need nervous system stimulation. They will do it on their own. Okay? They set the thermostat, which is the sending the signal, depolarization. Does that make sense to you? Right? Now, they can be influenced by the nervous system. Don't get that wrong, because the nervous system can override the thermostat. You see what I'm saying? It can send signals to say, can pacemaker cells depolarize more? And then they'll depolarize more, your heart rate goes up or down. Does that make sense to you? I mean, that nervous system can still override it. But it'll keep it at a certain rhythm, certain pace. And that's the pacemaker cells. They'll keep it at a certain pace. Really neat stuff. The heart contracts as one entire unit, okay? One big unit. All the cardiac muscle cells will contract at the same time, or, you know, be one unit. The influx of calcium causes then the SR to then release more calcium. So that's a big difference, because in skeletal muscle, we looked at the action potential going down the T-tubule and then causing the SR to open and then calcium gets secreted. Well, there's no action potential. What happens is that depolarization occurs, which means we influx calcium, and calcium gets used as the stimulation for the SR to release more calcium. So it's calcium on calcium, basically. Does that make sense to you? Calcium and calcium. Calcium's the key ion that we use in the heart muscle cells to then cause contraction. That's why calcium is really important, not only for your bones, but also for your heart. That's why, for example, in the hormones, we're reading calcium in blood. Because if we have too low of calcium in blood, we don't get enough calcium to the heart, and then what's going to happen? The heart doesn't contract hard enough, fast enough. That's why it's important. That's why, for example, if you bleed out, if you've got an injury that you start bleeding to death, right? You're losing ions. That's what we're losing fluid. Don't get me wrong. That's the volume. We're losing fluid, but the calcium and the ions are really, the electrolytes are really important. What's your heart going to respond to? Like trying to kind of still contract, but it doesn't have to do that. Okay, so refractory periods are going to change too, and I know that's kind of a, might not remember that type of property, but a refractory period is much, much longer in the cardiac muscle than we do see in the skeletal muscle. Which is saying basically there's a time period where the skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle can't contract again, right? In skeletal muscle, it's much, much shorter. So there's a small period before everything gets, repolarization happens, and then you can contract again. Well, in the cardiac muscle, it's much, much longer. The refractory period, the time period it takes for it to contract again is much longer. Almost the entire time it takes to contract is the refractory period. And the reason being is because we need to have time so that blood will fill up into the heart. Okay? So refractory period is long. The heart relies exclusively on aerobic respiration. Okay, so we're talking about metabolism now. Aerobic respiration is the process of using oxygen as the final electron acceptor in the electron transport chain to create ATP, right? It works on this process alone, almost exclusively, in the presence of oxygen. So it needs oxygen to create ATP. Needs it, needs it, needs it. And when you don't get it, then it will not work. The contraction will not occur. Skeletal muscle can actually use fermentation, right? Very shortly. It's a brief period it can use fermentation, but it can use it if it doesn't get enough oxygen, but not in the heart. The heart needs oxygen. If it doesn't get oxygen, it's not going to work. Okay, so some differences there. And there's even a table that shows you where cardiac versus skeletal muscle, there's the difference there. Concentrate on the cardiac, right?